This is a history video which today looks at the role of Lyndon B. Johnson in the civil rights campaign. Johnson had a long personal history of being involved in helping those less fortunate than themselves. He actually started off as a teacher in 1928, teaching in a segregated school in Texas, teaching a class of 28 Mexican Americans in what he described as one of the crummiest little towns in Texas. By the mid-1950s, he was a senator and one of the few Southern politicians who openly and actively supported the Brown v. Topeka ruling. Although he was careful to appease Southern racists, he believed that the South had to accept desegregation in order to make economic advances. Racial tensions were simply making the South unattractive to potential investors. He had presidential ambitions from an early age, and so it couldn't be seen as too narrowly Southern, so he was always keen to appeal to as many people as possible. Many of those close to Johnson said that he had a genuine sympathy for greater racial equality, even though he talked in good old boy language to other Southerners. He believed the time was ripe for change. He said, "The Negro fought in the Second World War, and he's not going to keep taking the shit we're dishing out. We're in a race with time. If we don't act, we're going to have blood in the streets." He became president following Kennedy's assassination in November 1963. On his inauguration in January 1964, he announced his vision of a great society for the USA, with an end to poverty and racial injustice. He was determined to get Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill through. He insisted that discrimination was morally wrong, and in one of his anecdotes he described how when his black cook drove to Texas, she couldn't use the whites-only facilities in a gas station. He said, "When they had to go to the bathroom, they'd pull off in a side road, and Zephyr Wright, the cook of the Vice President of the United States, would squat in the road to pee. That's wrong, and there ought to be something to change that." He felt duty-bound to get Kennedy's bills through. He was successful, but he also pushed through other legislation which significantly helped black people, apart from just the Civil Rights Act. His Elementary and Secondary Education Act gave federal funding to schools. By the end of the 1960s, the percentage of blacks with a high school diploma had increased from 40% to 60%. His 1965 Higher Education Act was even more successful. It gave significant aid to poor black colleges. The number of black college students quadrupled in a decade. Johnson's introduction of healthcare reforms for the poor helped blacks. The black infant mortality rate halved within a decade. A lot of the most recent attention, because it's the 50th anniversary, is centred on the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Selma and Bloody Sunday forced Johnson to ask Congress for the Voting Rights Bill. And the Voting Rights Act, which followed it, disallowed literacy tests and constitutional interpretation tests, those tests where people were expected to recite the entire Constitution and answer legal questions on tiny little parts of the Constitution. Those were all gone. Those are banned. It also set up federal registrars, not local men or women, but people appointed by the federal government. This had a dramatic effect on the South. By the end of 1966, only 4 of the old Southern racist Jim Crow states had less than 50% of their eligible blacks registered. By 1968, even Mississippi was up to 59%. By 1980, the proportion of blacks registered to vote across America was only 7% less than the proportion of whites. And the number of blacks elected to office grew dramatically too. It was a significant political gain for Johnson's Democratic Party. The new black voters greatly outweighed the lost white voters. Johnson was able to get so much legislation through due to several factors. In 24 years in Congress, he had huge experience in getting legislation through. He had an unusual 2/3 majority in Congress. It's very unusual for a president to have that level of control. Congressmen knew that constituents were unusually receptive at this time to righting the nation's wrongs, partly I think because they felt it might somehow atone for Kennedy's death. And Johnson was exceptionally persuasive. and determined, and he had a lifelong commitment to helping the poor. He also used his presidential executive authority to help blacks. He manipulated federal funding to offer subsidies to southern districts that were cooperative on school desegregation. He used black advisors, including future Congressman Barbara Jordan, and he appointed the first black Supreme Court judge, Thurgood Marshall. But there were a number of factors which restricted what he could do. After 1965, it became increasingly difficult for him to help blacks due to Congress. Congress blocking him, local officials getting in the way, the level of black violence and the cost of the Vietnam War all combined to limit his influence. Congress was unhelpful. It resisted a civil rights bill in 1966 which would have banned housing discrimination, and was only willing to accept it in 1968 in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination. Johnson could put forward civil rights programs, but he had to rely on local officials to carry them out, and sometimes they were reluctant to cooperate. Perhaps the biggest restriction on him came from the level of black violence. From 1964 to 68, there were successive summers of rioting in America's black ghettos. These riots caused a white backlash. As white television showed black youths shouting "burn, burn, burn," whites feared that black militants were driving the USA into a race war. Gun sales to suburban whites soared, and whites were turning against blacks and against LBJ's reform programs. Johnson was amazed and disappointed by what he later described as, quote, all that crazy rioting which almost ruined everything. The riots helped to ensure that Johnson could do little more to help blacks. A 1965 poll showed that 85% of whites advocated black self-improvement, more education and harder work, rather than government help. A 1966 poll showed that a huge 90% opposed civil rights legislation. The Vietnam War also played a huge part. Expense and distraction got in the way of anything that Johnson could do for civil rights. An example of the expense, in 1965, the federal government deficit, the amount of money that America really owes, was $1.6 billion. By 1968, it was $25.3 billion. All that means higher taxes, and white Americans already felt they were paying too much tax for the war without having to pay some more for improving black ghettos. In conclusion, Johnson played a hugely important role in ending de jure segregation in the South. His Voting Rights Act transformed Southern politics by giving blacks the opportunity to vote without fear. His Education Act speeded up school desegregation and helped black colleges. He'd been instrumental in the passing of 3 civil rights acts that gave blacks more political and economic opportunities. His civil rights legislation opened the way for a larger and richer black middle class. However, many blacks continued to suffer poor housing, poor schools, poor job opportunities, and an inability to get out of the poverty trap. Critics of Johnson said that the Great Society created a culture of welfare dependency. However, Thurgood Marshall thought that Johnson had got it right when he said, "You didn't wait for the times, you made them." Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this useful.